Welcome to Modern Farm Business Podcast. This podcast is designed to help the farm leader bring their business to the next level. We'll cover everything from leadership and finance to strategy and planning. I'm your host, Dean Hefta. In the last 20 years, our ability to produce data in business and industry has reached unprecedented levels, and farming is certainly no exception. Some days we can feel like we're drowning in data, but starving for wisdom. So joining me today to share his insights on dealing with data more effectively is Professor Jeff Camm, the Associate Dean of Business Analytics at Wake Forest School of Business. Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dean. Pleasure to be with you.
This is a really important topic today with the amount of information that we're able to produce. And, in the past decade, we've really seen an explosion in the use of digital tools in business, and we've seen that in farming. We're collecting more data in more ways than we ever thought possible. Now, from your perspective, when you think about data and information, what are some of the principles and concepts that you really want to begin with?
Sure. It might be instructive to think about what's going on in the marketplace around data. There's actually a lot of confusion in the marketplace, and let me try to describe my take on it. You'll see people with the title, for example, data science in the title, and other people have analytics. And I think it's useful to think about the differences in those two things. So we're talking about how to use data. And people will disagree on this, so this is my opinion, but it seems to me data science is more focused on the data itself. And so you think about people gathering, collecting a lot of data, and then they'll do something like data mining on that massive amounts of data to look for that nugget of information that maybe is really counterintuitive, but potentially very useful. Analytics, on the other hand, which is my area, is more problem-centric as opposed to data-centric. So in analytics, particularly in business analytics, we typically start with a business problem. And then the question is, okay, let's think about this problem, frame the problem, scope the problem. Now, what kind of data do we need to help solve this problem? And so it's a pool of the data rather than, say, a push of the data that I think is more typical in data science. And so I would say one is data-centric and sort of opportunistic, and the other is problem-centric and more pulling the data in that you need. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but that's one distinction, but in terms of how people are using data to make decisions today. So we can kind of look at it from, do we start with the problem we're trying to solve? More of a business approach, saying I'm running a business here. I've got limited time. I've got limited resources. I want to be as efficient as I can. And here are the problems that I need to solve. It could be around efficiency, versus I've got these digital tools that are collecting terabytes of data. And I believe because I'm collecting all that data that something good is going to happen. Is it safe to look at it in those two types of camps? That's perfect. Exactly. And again, analytics is the problem approach, and data science is the more data centric. We're collecting the data. What can we find in these data? Now, exactly. You've worked in a lot of different industries, and you have some specialties. But do you have an example? And certainly this doesn't have to be farming, because the reason I wanted you on this program is because you're not a farming expert. Because things like data and information and all of these things are really they affect everybody. I don't care if you're in the car wash business. It's about the fundamentals. And that's why it's really important to hear your message. But can you give us an example of how you have seen in business approaching it from a problem-centric approach and then going out and gathering the data has helped the business to maybe change how they think about something or change their efficiency? Sure, absolutely. My area within analytics is optimization. And the area in which I have consulted for the last 20 years or so is supply chain design. And I really got started in that area back in the early 90s when Procter & Gamble came to a group of faculty when I was at the University of Cincinnati
And the problem is easy to state, but very difficult to solve. So the problem was Procter & Gamble is a 150-year-old company at the time. They've purchased a lot of companies along the way. When you purchase a company, you purchase their production and distribution capacity. And they had so many mergers and acquisitions over the years, they knew that they had excess capacity in the supply chain. So the question was, what's the right capacity for each product that we make? Where should those plants be? Where should the distribution centers be to meet our service requirements and have a cost minimizing supply chain? Procter & Gamble had probably at that time 500 people collecting the data that we determined that we needed to optimize the supply chain, to tell P&G how to allocate its capacity across the supply chain, both in manufacturing and in distribution. One way to think about it is, where should my plants be? Which products should be made at which plants? How should we ship those to the distribution centers and then ultimately to the customers in the most cost efficient way and serve our customers at the level we expect? And so, 500 people go out and collect the data we determined that we needed. And what do we need? Well, we needed demand across the country. So we were able to collect demand for Procter & Gamble products aggregated up to the family level in 3-digit zip codes across, it was actually North America. So it was Canada, United States, and Mexico. And we needed transportation rates, what it cost to ship places. We needed the cost to manufacture goods in different locations. So massive amounts of data were collected, but it was all very intentional. It was data that we deemed we needed to solve that supply chain design problem. And so probably 500 people collected data. We built a nice little system that was interactive with a map on a laptop. It ran optimization routines in the background, and the product category teams inside Procter & Gamble used this system to make more informed decisions about capacity and location of facilities. So at the end of the project and 3 years out, when you do these kind of projects, you benchmark so you know what your current supply chain looks like, what the cost of that is. And after we run the model, so we use that benchmark to ascertain what the potential savings is. Later on, you do another benchmark to see what the realized savings is once you've reconfigured your supply chain. And the P&G documented for the Security and Exchange Commission, like 3 years out, that the savings from that supply chain redesign was in excess of $250 million a year in lower logistics costs. So that's an example of a design problem that had a huge impact on the operations of a Fortune 500 company. And now P&G is very, very strong in analytics. They're always listed as one of the best supply chain companies in the world.
So it sounds like it's really key to just to understand, regardless of what you're doing, whether it's a project that two people are working on, or a small business is working on, or a multi-billion-dollar multinational company, the principles are really the same. It's just the scale of the project that begins to change.
That's right. And I would say the fundamental step is the first one, right? And that's something as simple to say: identify and define the problem you're trying to solve. And once you do that, the modeling and everything is a little, I would say half art, half science. Once you have the problem properly defined, then the task is, okay, what data do we have available that we can bring to bear on this problem? And then the math part, the analytics, the real analytics, the algorithms and all that is really, in my mind, the easy part. And so, you have to be, again, laser focused on the problem and have an understanding of what data you have and what pieces of that data are relevant for the problem at hand. When I first started in this area back in, I had my PhD back in 1984, the problem was we didn't have data. Now that we have so much data, the issue is, how do you sort through the data to find what's relevant and what's not to the problem you're trying to solve? But it's a lot different than, when I started back in the 80s in what is now known as analytics.
Yeah, that's a good point, because now we're just drowning in it, and that ends up bogging us down in a different way. So that's been quite a transition that you've seen from the desert to the ocean of data. Okay, so it seems like for a lot of people, they fall in love with technology because it's technology. we can't just throw out the human experience as a part of this and say, well, I mean, this is what the data tells us. How do we make sure we don't just let computers take over?
Exactly. Oh, yeah. That's fundamental. I had a mentor early in my career, a guy named Gene Woolsey, who was at the Colorado School of Mines. And he had, I think, the right approach. He basically said, you use the analytics up to the point where you're no longer also using common sense. If you stop using common sense or business sense, then you're going down the wrong path. So the analytics is supposed to augment the business sense that you have. Sometimes you'll find counterintuitive results, but unless you can somehow explain or show the real impact that's going to have, management's not going to accept those counterintuitive results. So you have to really back up, be able to communicate, again, benchmark what you're doing so you can show the potential impact. And so it's always about focusing on the problem, keeping in mind that you have to prove the value of what you're prescribing to do when you're talking to management.
Yeah, you mentioned the problem there again. I want to jump back to that because it seems so important. A couple of questions. One is, would you say that when most of this goes off the rails, it's because they didn't really identify the problem question very well? And could you give us maybe some tools, or how do we know if we're doing a good job of really first getting that problem identified?
So what happens, analytics is sort of like the same situation when you go to see your doctor, right? You have to, if you're an analytics professional, what happens is managers describe symptoms of problems. They don't describe the actual problem. So they might say, I have too much inventory. I have inventory in the warehouse. It has dust on it. Something's wrong. And so a good analytics professional will, you'll get a call from a manager and they'll describe symptoms, and you'll ask a series of questions that then narrow down to what is really the nugget of the problem. Was it, in the case of the excess inventory, is it because of some kind of seasonality and demand we weren't taking into account in our forecasting technology, for example? So it's a diagnosis, really. Again, managers describe symptoms, and you have to just ask the right questions. And one of the right questions comes with experience, and sort of the inquisitiveness, I guess, that most analytics, mathematics types of people have. So it's about asking the right questions. And sometimes you can ask the right question, think you have the problem defined, and you kind of get lost in the data. You might grab data that are convenient, but not the most relevant data. So there are a lot of places where it can go wrong. But I would say the number one reason is not defining the problem adequately. There's an example, for a while I thought it was urban legend, but in fact it's been verified. There's a story that goes all the way back to World War II that illustrates the issue of having the right data. So a lot of this analytics wave, by the way, started back in World War II. And the Allied forces were doing a study with Spitfire fighter planes. And the idea was, we're losing a lot of these planes to enemy fire. If we can just figure out what the hot spots are. So sort of based on how our pilots fly and how the enemy is trained to shoot, there are these clusters on the Spitfire planes that are more likely to be hit during warfare. So what they did was a plane would come back and they would plot on a piece of graph paper with the Spitfire outline on it, the data where the bullet holes were. And they did this every time a Spitfire came back, they would plot this. So you can envision this piece of graph paper with an overlay on it with the outline of an airplane. And you can start to see clusters of hot spots where these planes are more likely to be hit. So the problem was, let's find where we're most likely to be hit so we can reinforce these spots on the planes so that we lose fewer planes. Whole problem with that is they had the exact opposite data set that they needed. Mm-hmm. So what they had was the planes that returned, and the data sets that they needed actually were the planes that had gone down because of fire.
Right.
So an example of the problem is well defined, but you get sidetracked and you lose track of what data you really need, and you wind up, in some sense, they answered the complementary problem. Here are the spots that do not matter, right?
Exactly.
In terms of the plane surviving.
We found out where we can get shot.
Exactly. Exactly right. So it's easy to get lost in the analysis.
Especially now with so much data.
Exactly. It's even worse.
Here's a little twist on that. And that is, we talk about things like data. You hear people talk about information. You talk about people referring to knowledge and insight. Tell me about how you view those things as different from each other, if you do, and how does one move into another if they're different?
Sure. If I can, I'll go to a sports analogy. So if we go to baseball, when I think about data, that's more like how a hitter performs in an at-bat. They come up in the inning, something happens. They strike out, they fly out, they hit a home run. So that's one piece of data, how they performed in one at-bat. The information maybe is more like the batting average of that player. So it's data synthesized, aggregated, summarized, and now it's been turned from raw data into information. And then insight might be, okay, we're going to use what we know from the information to get to that aha. And in the case of, say, my baseball example, we find out that if it's Major League Baseball, batting average goes up for players the year before their contract expires. That's an insight. That's the kind of stuff that also happens in business all the time, right? So you have raw data, you synthesize it and summarize it to get information. Now use that information to learn something that wasn't obvious.
Right. So that's where you're starting to apply your experience and your perspective and start turning it into more meaning. And okay, if this means this, here's what we're going to do about it.
Exactly. At the end of the day, none of this matters unless you can take your analysis, get that insight, and then influence whoever the decision maker is. Otherwise, it just all goes on the cutting room floor, right?
Exactly. I mean, we feel like we did a lot of stuff, right? And generated all this.
Right. Yeah, we had fun. Yeah. Right.
So where do you see data analytics going? What does the future look like? It's changing so quickly.
It absolutely is. It's exciting. The biggest thing that I really see coming down in the future is this idea, and two things may be tied together, the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence. So the Internet of Things has to do with companies are now, when they sell a product, they might have sensors or some other kind of data collection device inside the product they're selling. So when they sell you that product, you are relinquishing to that company data, and then they're turning that data into a product or service. Let me give you a couple of examples. GE Aviation sells jet engines. Now, what GE Aviation also does is every engine they make has a lot of sensors on it. So when a GE-powered aircraft takes off anywhere around the world, those sensors collect data from those jet engines, and they go back to GE Aviation. GE Aviation then takes that data and turns it into a service that they sell to their customers. So when you buy a GE aircraft engine, you can also buy a service agreement that will predict for you when maintenance is required on that engine. Will also help you fly the plane in a more fuel efficient manner. So they'll give you some what we call prescriptive analytics, prescribe how to fly. It'll give you a flight plan that will help you save fuel based on the sensor data. And they're collecting data not just from our company that bought GE engines, but from all their customers. So they have massive amounts of data that they can learn from, and they sell that back to their clients as a service. Another example is if you've seen these Coca-Cola freestyle machines where you can basically press the button and get a lot of different flavors together out of a Coca-Cola machine. So think about that. If every time somebody makes their own mixture that's stored, and Coca-Cola is interested in what should my next new cola flavor be, every time somebody makes one of those new mixtures and it's stored somewhere and collected over the internet through that Coca-Cola freestyle machine, Coca-Cola has a lot of great data as far as what the customers are preferring and can come up with a new product based on data collected from those machines.
Great. My son loves those Coke machines. So that really hits home. This has been really interesting. If you're going to give some advice to a small business owner about data, what's one thing that you want to make sure that they know or understand?
I guess if a business owner, I would say, going back to where we started, what's giving you heartburn in your business? How can you improve your business? What is the real problem you're trying to solve? And then making sure that over time you're collecting data that will allow you to solve that problem. It could be the allocation of resources being more efficient. It could be providing a higher level of service. It could be cost containment. But whatever is the issue that is keeping you awake at night, is there a way with data combined with your business sense that would make you more informed, that would allow you to achieve a better business outcome?
Makes a lot of sense. Joining us today was Professor Jeff Camm, the Associate Dean of Business Analytics at Wake Forest School of Business. Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your insights and perspectives on this important topic with us.
Thank you, Dean. I appreciate you having me on your podcast.
Some great perspectives there from Professor Camm on how do we approach all of this data that we're able to collect now. A few things that stood out to me that I wanted to highlight. One is make sure to spend time on the problem. Start with that problem. And as he said, it's easy to state and hard to solve, but that's where we have to start, and that's where our best energy is invested. And as a part of that, how easy it is for people around us, managers, ourselves, employees, to really be describing the symptoms of the problem and not the problem itself. So make sure to take the time to dig in, dig down, and ask those follow-up questions to find out what's the real problem that we're solving, or are we just dealing with the symptoms? And another thing that stood out to me was, the computer, the analysis, the data by itself isn't enough. We have to get to that point where we have to bring in people, where we have to bring in common sense to really address the problem that's at hand. We can't just push the button and take the information blindly. It reminds me of people that you hear, they end up in a snowy mountain logging trail, stranded for days because they blindly followed their GPS navigation into a place where they stopped using their common sense. And that can happen to us when it comes to how we use data. So make sure we use common sense when we're making these decisions. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I hope it was interesting and thought-provoking, and I look forward to having you join me again next week. Take a moment, if you haven't yet, subscribe to this podcast where you get podcasts. Tell a friend about what we're doing here. And if you have any ideas on topics or things that you'd like to talk about, shoot me an email, dean@modernfarmbusiness.com. Have a great week. Thanks.